Vietnam has had enough of China's ambitions in the South China Sea, especially now that Beijing has yet again provoked Hanoi with a move that won't surprise you. But China is risking a lot in this latest round of the Great Game in one of the world's most heated regions. It hates when other countries have the guts to stand up to it, and Vietnam has proven that more than once. But what's really fueling this high-stakes feud, and just how far is China willing to push its luck? Since China seized the Paracel Islands in 1974, its clashes with Vietnam over South China Sea territory have only gotten fiercer. The two countries continue to battle over rocks, shoals, and even Vietnam's maritime boundaries, with flashpoints like the Spratlys standing as symbols of China's relentless drive for dominance. As China's power has surged, so has its audacity, dredging reefs, building fortresses on remote islands, and flexing its muscle against the commerce of other nations. But China's aggressions don't stop at Vietnam. It's ramped up pressure on the Philippines too. Since grabbing the Scarborough Shoal in 2012, China has flouted international law, laying claim to waters that clearly belong in the Philippines' exclusive economic zone. The result? A surge in volatile encounters between Filipino and Chinese vessels, including a recent October 8th clash where a Chinese Coast Guard vessel fired on a Philippine Fisheries Bureau ship near the contested shoal. Yet China may find Vietnam a much harder rival to back down, especially now that it's pushing further by reviving old claims to the Gulf of Tonkin, a step that guarantees a fierce response from Hanoi. China had once claimed the entirety of the Gulf of Tonkin under the original 11-line map drawn before the Communist Party took over. Mao later abandoned that claim, but it appears that China might want to start the process of asserting it again. Foreign Ministry spokesman Wang Wenbin said it was China's legitimate and lawful right to determine the territorial sea baseline in the Gulf of Tonkin. Vietnam's response was somewhat different. Its foreign ministry made the following statement: Vietnam believes that coastal countries need to abide by the UNCLOS when establishing the territorial baseline used to calculate the width of territorial waters to ensure that it does not affect the lawful rights and interests of other countries, including the freedom of navigation and the freedom of passage through straits used for international maritime activities in accordance with UNCLOS. China and Vietnam had seemingly settled their maritime demarcation line with an agreement in 2000. While the latest map does not interfere with that settled boundary, Hanoi knows that the word settled is written in water as far as Beijing is concerned. Only the fear of taking a few hits in return will prevent China from expanding this latest claim in the future. Fortunately for Vietnam, it's taken more than a few steps to give China the chills, both in the past and present. For Vietnam, deterring China begins with forging better relations with its old enemy, the United States. Since 2020, Vietnam has participated in the Quad Plus framework. It's also significantly increased its economic ties to the United States, with bilateral trade more than quadrupling from $30 billion in 2013 to $139 billion in 2023. That year, President Biden paid a historic state visit to Hanoi. To mark the occasion, the two nations announced that they were elevating their bilateral relationship to a comprehensive strategic partnership. This is not an alliance. Vietnam has a long-standing policy in place to avoid such entanglements. However, its drift into America's orbit is clear. Vietnam has been reluctant to forge fully fledged security ties, but it seems inevitable that geopolitical reality will increase defense cooperation. Forging deeper economic ties with the United States gives it an incentive to assist Vietnam in its disputes with China. Vietnam is also seeking to host more factories for American companies on its territory, which is a move that makes sense for both sides. For the United States, relocating supply chains to Vietnam is important to ensure that China has less leverage over the American economy. The more Vietnam hosts important manufacturing parts of the supply chain for the American and global economies, the more important its tranquility becomes to the rest of the world, which means more of an interest in defending it against China's attempts at expansion. But Vietnam is not only looking to forge deeper partnerships with the superpower across the Pacific. Vietnam has also forged a comprehensive strategic partnership with Japan, an upgrade in their bilateral relations that was announced in November 2023. That same month, Vietnam and Indonesia strengthened their cooperation on defense. The two countries declared that their navies, coast guards, defense industries, training methods, and strategic research would have practical and effective coordination at all levels. In August 2024, Vietnam strengthened its military cooperation with the Philippines, particularly in maritime matters, and committed to resolving whatever disputes they had peacefully. Both countries dispute islands in the South China Sea, but know that they must team up against their much more powerful common adversary. Vietnam has also forged deeper ties with India, which also has an interest in preventing China's expansion in the region. As recently as November 2024, Vietnam and India engaged in bilateral military exercises. This VinBax 2024 exercise was meant to enhance the joint military capability of both countries in their medical and engineering contingents as part of a broader United Nations peacekeeping operation. The exercise was small, but was a demonstration of the two countries' shared interest. Vietnam is a geographically important part of India's Necklace of Diamonds strategy to counter China's so-called String of Pearls in the Indian Ocean. Vietnam and India have not had as robust an economic relationship as they might have wanted, but recent moves suggest a willingness on both countries to fix this. In July, Vietnam's Prime Minister, Pham Minh Chinh, called for a $20 billion bilateral trade target between the two countries. Vietnam and India also signed MOUs on increased cooperation in aviation, logistics, pharmaceuticals, and renewable energy. The forum where these MOUs were signed also saw the first direct flight between Da Nang and Ahmedabad, symbolizing hopes for greater interconnectivity. Vietnam is steadily building a coalition to balance against China, yet it maintains a fierce self-reliance. Observing China's aggressions in the region, including toward the Philippines, a treaty ally of the United States, Vietnam is determined to strengthen its own defenses without becoming over-reliant on any foreign power. The US support remains a key factor, yet Vietnam aims to stand strong and prepared on its own terms. Vietnam has been more historically willing to contest China's claims in the area, even if it comes with a risk of escalation. In fact, it has its own outposts in the Spratly Islands just like China. China occupies the three largest features in the Spratlys, Mischief, Subi, and Fiery Cross Reefs, but Vietnam occupies 5 of the remaining 7 largest features, including Bark Canada Reef, the 4th largest. Satellite footage from the Center for Strategic and International Studies Asia Maritime Transparency Initiative has revealed that Vietnam built 692 acres of land across 10 features in the Spratlys between November 2023 and June 2024. This pace was significantly above the 404 acres between January and November of 2023 and 342 acres in all of 2022. In total, Vietnam has created 2,360 acres of land in the South China Sea, about half of China's 4,650, and Hanoi has done this in little time too. In 2021, Vietnam had only created 329 acres. As an example, Vietnam's Canada Bark Reef is now 4,318 meters long. This is more than enough for Vietnam to build a runway for military aircraft like those seen in China's fortified islands. Several of the features boast new trench networks and coastal defenses. Some have also hosted temporary helipads. Surprisingly, China has done little to contest Vietnam's increasing presence in the South China Sea. While China has greatly tightened the screws around the Philippines, it's avoided doing the same with Vietnam. Although it's possible that China has avoided raising issues with Vietnam because it does not want to create issues with multiple countries at the same time and avoid bringing them into a closer coalition, Zach Cooper and Gregory Poling, writing for War on the Rocks, don't view this as a likely explanation. After all, China under Xi Jinping has raised territorial issues with multiple countries on more than one front simultaneously, ranging from the Senkaku Islands in southern Japan to the remote Himalayas that have seen clashes with India. A much more assertive China has been the norm for Xi's tenure. Instead, the likelier answer for why China has not contested Vietnam is because it believes this particular rival is harder to bully. Cooper and Poling report that Chinese officials have privately expressed their belief that the Philippines will go along with what China wants in the end. Rodrigo Duterte's presidency from 2016 to 22 reinforced this sentiment. Duterte often tried to forge closer relations with China in an attempt to become more independent from the United States, despite the South China Sea dispute. That idea backfired and gave Beijing the impression that it could get away with what it wanted at the Philippines' expense. Vietnam, on the other hand, has repeatedly proven ready to contest China's moves. It accepted battle in 1974 and 1988 after all. Vietnam might have lost those clashes, but it proved its willingness to inflict cost on an aggressive China. And it's not always lost when things have gotten hot. China knows all too well what Vietnam is capable of from its miserable border war with the Vietnamese in 1979, where the People's Liberation Army performed poorly in the face of battle-hardened Vietnamese troops. China's higher echelons know what Vietnam is capable of. Two of Beijing's current top military officers, Generals Zhang Yuxia and Liu Zhenli of the Central Military Commission, are outliers because, unlike the vast majority of their peers, they actually have combat experience. They are veterans of that border war, so they know what Vietnamese troops are capable of. With this in mind, they have likely advised caution when it comes to dealing with Vietnam. Vietnam has the world's third highest amount of total military personnel, including reserves, with 5.850 million total members. That means that 56.9 per 1,000 people in Vietnam are members of the country's armed forces. In terms of active personnel, Vietnam is ranked 9th in the world with 600,000. Although the active army is far smaller than China's, Vietnam has proven itself a capable fighting force and unafraid to stand up to China. Chinese leaders don't need to go as far back as the border war to remember this either. On May 1, 2014, China sent an oil rig, the Haiyang Shiyu 981, and 3 service ships south from Hainan Island. The ship, which the China National Offshore Oil Corporation's chairman had earlier called a strategic weapon, moved near Triton Island in the Paracels. These are the waters that China and Vietnam both claim, but China crossed the line, literally. The rig then tried to conduct exploratory drilling on 2 blocks of hydrocarbons that Vietnam had claimed but did not begin developing. The location was 120 nautical miles east of Vietnam's Lai Son Island and 180 miles south of Hainan, making it a hotspot on the two nations' theoretical economic limits under UNCLOS. The oil rig fell within the Vietnamese side of a delimiting line drawn between the two countries. Perhaps looking at what happened in Scarborough Shoal 2 years earlier, Vietnam wasted no time in reasserting its rights to the area. Ships from the Vietnamese Coast Guard and Fisheries Resources Surveillance were immediately sent to intercept the Chinese oil rig and prevent it from conducting its explorations in the area. On May 3rd, the Vietnamese ships tried to disrupt the oil rig's operations. China quickly sent more ships to assist the rig, including ships from its Coast Guard, civilian fishing vessels, and possibly ships from the People's Liberation Army Navy. China put its ships in protective rings, which it had done in disputes with Vietnam on the seas before. Collisions between Chinese and Vietnamese ships happened immediately, with both sides blaming the other. By May 7th, Hanoi reported that 60 Chinese ships and dozens of aircraft were in the area, while Vietnam increased its number of ships to 29. The Vietnamese quickly repaired their damaged ships and sent them back into the fray. In Vietnam itself, large protests against China's actions occurred outside the embassy in Hanoi. The demonstrations turned into fully fledged rioting on May 13th, when vandals damaged foreign-owned factories that they believed were under Chinese ownership. At least 200 people had been arrested over the violence and chaos. Beijing responded fiercely and accused Hanoi of egging the violence on. The Chinese government even issued travel warnings. The situation at sea escalated from there. China accused Vietnam of deploying 60 ships, while Vietnam said China deployed as many as 130. The ships were larger than their Vietnamese counterparts, but that didn't stop Vietnam from continuing to contest the attempt by the Chinese to tap the oil in the area, despite one of its fishing vessels being sunk in a collision. There were even rumors that China had mobilized troops in the border regions. But on May 27th, China suddenly ended the standoff by pulling the oil rig northeast of Triton Island. Officially, the reason was that a second round of exploration for oil and gas was beginning. In June, a high-ranking Chinese official visited Hanoi, which coincided with some of the Chinese Coast Guard ships withdrawing and the oil rig's drilling equipment being retracted. On July 15th, the rig withdrew from the area a month ahead of schedule. The attempt to bully Vietnam out of these waters failed. It was one of Beijing's biggest setbacks in the South China Sea dispute. Clashes with Vietnam in 2019 and 23 continued to prove that Vietnam continues to be willing to stand up to Chinese attempts at coercion. With Vietnam's continued cooperation with foreign partners that also have an interest in containing China's expansion into the South China Sea, Vietnam aims to make sure that it will be in an even stronger position to contest China's claims in the future. Understandably, China does not want to repeat these experiences. It also does not want to risk creating a more durable coalition in the area, as Vietnam has been attempting to do. So China has recently tried to make nice with the Vietnamese. In December 2023, only 3 months after Biden's visit, China attempted to strengthen its bilateral relations with Vietnam. The two countries signed a 16-page joint declaration and 36 cooperation documents during Xi's own state visit to Hanoi that month. The agreements included infrastructure priorities, such as the joint building of a new bridge across the Red River. When completed, it will connect China's Yunnan province with Lao Cai in Vietnam. The two countries also intend to create interoperable railways that connect southern China to Vietnam's port of Haiphong. There were also communications agreements, a memorandum of understanding on developing green technologies, and a pledge to create a new economic zone to make trade and investment between the two countries easier. Surprisingly, there were security statements as well, including an agreement to create a hotline between the Vietnamese Agriculture Ministry and the Chinese Coast Guard to respond to surprise incidents over fisheries in the South China Sea, joint rescue operations at sea, security and intelligence cooperation against hostile forces, and even joint naval patrols in the Gulf of Tonkin. China has increased its imports of durians from Vietnam, but recent actions against this partnership may be on shaky ground. This month, China's customs officials halted shipments from 33 Vietnamese durian suppliers, citing quality concerns amid a rush for market share. However, while China seems content with Vietnam producing fruit like durians, it has its sights set on controlling far more critical industries. China has attempted to flood the global market with dumped steel sold for a lower price than what it takes to produce. China's strategy comes from its own economic weakness, as its construction sector has not been as strong as anticipated after the COVID-19 pandemic. Chinese steelmakers created more product than the market demanded. This overproduction only exacerbated an existing excess of product in response to the pre-pandemic tariffs that the first Trump administration levied on China. China attempted to circumvent these fees by producing more steel to sell at lower prices. As a result, there is now a vast oversupply of steel in China. China has tried to make use of the excess by dumping the product on Southeast Asia in particular. The artificially cheap steel puts Southeast Asian countries like Vietnam at the risk of long-term dependency on Chinese steel. Steel is a vital component of almost every part of a national economy. Construction projects, of course, require it, but the price of steel affects the price of all consumer goods directly or indirectly. It's also a vital industry for national defense. Should Vietnam's steel industry fall under Chinese influence, it would have a tough time indeed building the ships it needs for another standoff with China over rights in the South China Sea, to name only one example. This is why Vietnam is fighting Chinese steel dumping. In December 2023, it imposed an anti-dumping tax on cold-rolled steel coming from China. This fee was in response to a $31.4 billion steel trade deficit with China in the first 11 months of 2023. In June 24, Vietnam began an anti-dumping investigation into steel products coming from China and South Korea. This was another demonstration of Vietnam being a country less willing to put up with China's typical tactics. On the whole, Vietnam is unlike other countries in the South China Sea. It's had a consistent history of standing up to its more powerful northern neighbor, often at considerable risk, and the regime in Beijing has a preference for bullying and doing its business in the shadows. It asserts itself with salami-slicing tactics and in gray zone operations where it has an overwhelming hard power or psychological advantage, but when the light of day gets shined on its operations, it reacts differently. As the clash in 2014 showed, the Chinese government hates when it gets itself involved in an extended and highly public dispute. Beijing is actually quite risk-averse. When it calculates that it has a risk of incurring significant costs, it tends to back off, as it did in 2014. Vietnam has been unusually aware of this fact compared to China's other neighbors and has acted accordingly. Vietnam might not have been able to stop China from taking over the Paracels or much of the Spratlys, but has always shown its willingness to fight. Sometimes that's enough to scare the bully off. But what do you think is coming next in the tense relationship between China and Vietnam? Don't forget to let us know in the comments. Also, make sure to hit the like button and subscribe for more military analysis from military experts.